Cloud adoption is ramping up, but prevention-based security isn't enough for the hybrid attack surface. That's why Gartner predicts that 60% of enterprise security budgets will go towards detection and response in 2020. ExtraHop Reveal X Cloud delivers cloud-native network detection and response for the hybrid enterprise, the only SaaS-based NDR solution for AWS. Request a 30-day free trial of Reveal X Cloud at extrahop.com/trial. That's extrahop.com/trial. Keep your company and products relevant, competitive, and reliable by standardizing your security framework to protect intellectual property, become a reliable business partner, and guard financial and customer information. Standards Connect is an online standards management solution from ANSI. It's standards access simplified. Standards Connect is a cost-saving, fully customizable solution for entrepreneurs and companies that spend $2,000 or more per year on standards and want to translate spend into a subscription model, want to simplify access, search, monitoring, and collaboration, or need a centralized hub of standards for multiple users at one or more locations. Get a free trial at securityweekly.com/ANSI. That's /ANSI.
Welcome back to Business Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman, joined by Mike Shima and John Kinsella. Register for one of our upcoming webcasts with ServiceNow, Great Horn, or Core Security, or all of them, by going to securityweekly.com. Click the webcast drop-down from the main menu and select registration. If you've missed any of our previously recorded webcasts, you can find them in our on-demand library by selecting On Demand from the webcast drop-down. If you attend any of our webcasts, you will receive 1 CPE credit per webcast. All right, let's get into some articles this week, gentlemen. So on this show, since John, Mike, you're new, we tend to cover more on the leadership communication side, primarily because this show's targeted more at the CISO leadership. And so we have an interesting interview with the CISO from Cisco. And I also have some CIO articles in here because a lot of the challenges that the CIOs go through, I think CISOs also go through. So they're very relevant from a leadership perspective, which is why you see those types of articles here. But I wanted to dig in first into the CISO interview from Cisco, because there was some interesting questions here, and I don't want to get into all of them, but there's a couple that I thought were pretty interesting to dig into. So Steve Martino was interviewed by CIO Dive, I think is who did this interview, and asked 5 questions. And it's a pretty long interview for anybody who reads it. But when I looked at the first question and answer set, I thought it was kind of interesting. What kind of pressure is Cisco facing with security products and working with cross-company teams? And we actually had the CSO from the supply chain side on this show a couple months back and talking about supply chain security. So if you think about Cisco as a networking gear company, think about the supply chain security that Cisco has to think about to make sure that their products are secure. So product security and supply chain was definitely one of the big highlights in that question.
Yeah, I thought this was a long article, but a decent sized interview. But I thought it was actually worth the read. And I might be new on the air on Security Weekly, on Business Security Weekly, but I've been listening longer than AppSec Security Weekly. I've always found some really great ideas on here. But as you were saying, that number one question, what I really liked there is how he actually broke it out into those 4 sort of, these are the areas where we focus our missions around. I think he sort of, at least the way that interview is edited, I think they bookmarked really nicely with that first question. And then also the last question around, they asked him what kept him up at night. But he took a step back and said, hey, well, let's see if we can rephrase the wording on that. But then the way he actually answered the question really sort of, I think, very quickly showed the maturity of their InfoSec project or their overall program. He's basically, what he said was, to paraphrase, is what keeps me awake is the things which I don't know about, right? So that's a very sort of a Zen type way of answering it, but I think that sort of at the same time shows they understand where their KPIs are, what they need to measure, what's going on. Now that they've done all that, you still don't just stop looking, right? You still need to look around and figure out what else is coming for me. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and it was that concept of emerging trends in the things that are how is technology changing? What kind of impact does that have on our business as Cisco? Those are the things I don't know about yet, right? And so You're right. They have a very mature program. They've got executive buy-in from the top. They've had that executive buy-in for years and have developed a really comprehensive security program. But where he answers that last question is he goes, it's what I'm not aware of, right? How do I know what the latest trends are going to do that I don't know yet that potentially have an impact on what we've built?
Yeah, and one of the things that stood out to me is that even though, what don't I know is what scares me. One of the things he did describe is essentially like that, handling that zero trust model, or BYOD, is essentially describing people can, enroll in their remote access program pretty much in an automated manner and secure manner. So it's not the idea that they, the way to counter what we don't know is by being stricter and stricter and unifying and putting a whole lot of more controls on a very single type of endpoint, something like that. It sounded like that part of that middle section of the interview, I'll call out, sounded like that maturity, so they can tamp down and not be really worried about those aspects, and really tie back to that, what he led off with, the idea of, as he's describing, supply chain, as well as, to me, the part that was really neat to see is that transformation as well into, we're also operating software, we're operating networks for customers as well. So it's sort of like a DevSecOps and description of DevSecOps right there, and going from just building hardware, having a supply chain considerations, to now just operating in the hardware, operating software as well.
Yeah, he listed out, you brought up a great point on this whole BYOD point, right? It wasn't that you had to only use Cisco-owned devices. He said those days are over, right? People are using personal email, all kinds of things. So they came up with a simple, 9 basic things you have to do to gain access, right? It was things like have a screen lock, have a password. You have to make sure you encrypt your disk, right? It's the basic stuff, right? And he said, look, if you do these 9 basic things, then your devices are allowed on the network. They have access. That makes your employees happy, makes them productive. And look, it's just part of life, right? It wasn't very restrictive. It just some basic common sense guidelines.
One of the things I've been talking about this year, and anytime someone lets me on a stage, is in the DevSecOps space and the AppSec space, we've got all our users are automating like crazy. My point being that the security folks need to also automate, right? You have to embrace this concept of automation, not just to keep up, but actually, do a big old bear hug and bring these folks in closer. But I think, Matt, is what you said there a little further back, is it really comes down to he has buy-in from even his executive team. And I'm going to take that ball and steal and run with it to your next article you brought up about CIO transformation. And I think one of the really key things here is tying these two pieces together is whoever that person is in that leadership role, either in CIO or CISO, you have to manage up. You have to be able to get people to understand that it's not just a role here of making sure things are secure. It's how can we transform this organization and being more automated, being more proactive, being more KPI driven, and improving that maturity of the overall model. But you can't just do that in your role. Very few of us are lucky enough that you get carte blanche, right? So you have to actually convince some other people above you, not just below.
Yeah, and it is a business enabling role. Both the CIO, the CISO, they're in business enabling roles these days. And if you think about the challenges that the CIOs and the CISOs have, which is why we talk a lot about these types of topics, is they have to not only understand business goals and objectives of how the business needs to operate to meet its corporate objectives, then how do technology and then the security of that technology have to be aligned into those strategic goals, right? How do you allow technology transformation? How do you allow your security processes to make it easy for the business to achieve its goals? And those are difficult challenges, I think, for both the CIO and CISO in most organizations. And to your point, John, right? You have to manage up and down the stack in those environments so that you are viewed upon as a true business enabler, not as a business, somebody who's trying to disrupt or stop business from moving forward.
There was another really interesting aspect of that business enablement that was called out in the first article. It was that fourth mission part talking about data, customer data, protecting data, keeping it
Yes.
private, keeping employee data. And also, too, in the second article that John brought us into, does also mention like the rise of a chief data officer, or even, I don't think it's mentioned in this one, or even a chief privacy officer. But that's also where the CIO, maybe they're an enabler in the technical aspects, enabling that sort of zero trust or BYOD type of design, but they also need to have a really good partnership with that business enablement of data and analytics. Everything from where are you putting the logs? Are you actually doing any analytics on logs, as well as depending on whatever your application is and the type of data you collect, are you being a good steward of it, as well as depending on, like, are you an ad-driven business model? Are you mining it for, dollars, those types of things? And that's where this idea of a partnership with that chief data officer, or just having that CIO role, having a good view into data management, I think is really key to call out as well.
Yeah, and that one actually ties into the fourth article, which should have probably been the third article, which is this whole concept of integrated risk management, right? We have to realize that these new roles at the executive, they talked about the chief data officer, the chief digital officer, the chief, I think it was privacy officer, and then there was all kinds of them, right? You're seeing all these new executive titles pop up. But at the end of the day, each of these executive roles own a component of the risk management framework. And the fourth article that's listed in the wiki really talks about, the need to think about an integrated risk management approach. I have a ton of experience in the GRC, governance, risk management, compliance days. I built a product in this space. I tried to fix one in this space, right? But that disconnect between the IT, the security, the other executives that all have a stake in the risk management of the organization is where we're trying to move to as an industry, right? This concept of integrated risk management. But that means all these executives have to work together, leveraging the data that they have to make better risk decisions. And it's not a single executive that owns all this stuff. There's multiples at play here. And so communication becomes a very important part of these roles as well.
Yeah, the fourth article. Go ahead, John.
I was just going to quickly say, so one, thank you for bringing up that area 4 on the article number 1. Sorry, everyone, we keep bouncing around. These are good articles. But I think that, because I didn't put on my notes, but my takeaway on that one was, it's sort of an eye-opener the way he said it. And I think that's why I'm coming back. I think it's really worth thinking about for a second. You're a CISO of an org, right? Many people in that really think about, I have to protect the application, I have to protect customer data. But, if you look at any sort of top 20, top 50 Glassdoor type rankings of, like, those top companies where you're talking about your family and the people you work with, right? So now take a step back and go, am I securing my friends' data? Because that's what you've got inside the company around your employees and all that type of data. So that's quite honestly a little more important still than protecting your application that you don't want to be on the front page of the Times, we always say, but you definitely don't want to be on the front page of the Times for a hack that all your employee data got stolen. So I think that's really something to meditate on for a few minutes, I think.
Yeah,
you're right. There's a difference between being on the front page of the Times and being in front of a congressional committee, for sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah.
I wanted to call out. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
So I was going to say, continue our theme of jumping between articles, 1 and 4, actually. That last part where in the first article was saying, what keeps you up at night, or what are you worried about? If you notice, he didn't say the next 0 day or the next, the next sky is falling type of vuln. And in this article about integrated risk management, there was a comment too about, what's your next business killing event that might be a cyber attack or 0 day. And I just wanted to kind of tweak that idea of a 0 day being, the business killing aspect, because if you're approaching this from a strategic perspective, you're working on, you're deploying a kill chain. So it's not like you have one new vulnerability is going to take down your entire business. It's if there's one vulnerability and you didn't have a detection capability, you didn't have an endpoint capability to identify it, you didn't have an incident response plan to react quickly, you didn't have a threat hunting team to go out and find if this 6-month-old vulnerability has actually been exploited and there already are attackers on your network. So those are things just want to call out as you start about these like sharing integrated risk management and trying to figure out where are the roles that you can bring in different actors in your organization to be part of this kill chain, so you actually can go to sleep and not really worry about the next 0 day and really worry about what don't I know that's more fundamental to a class of attack that's going to go after my business.
Right. And this is where I've complained about the old approach to GRC for the longest time. Is GRC did a really good job from the top, right? Here's my where I think my risk registry, here's where I think my risks are, here's the different controls that I think I should have in place, and go out and I assess those once a year and say, oh yeah, those controls are in place and working. And then at the bottom of the stack, from the bottom up, I've got all the security data. I've made investments in detection technologies and incident response capabilities and all these other things. But the problem is the two have never connected well, right? This concept of, are my controls operating effectively to mitigate risk, with all the data that's being collected down here by the security teams. When you think about integrated risk management, the two have to come together. The data that is in all these detections and response tools and all these capabilities that you built have to influence and adjust the potential risk to the organization, because if these things are happening, that those controls can't be effectively working. Because if they were, then these activities wouldn't be happening under the covers. And it's that gap in the way the GRCs and the security tools have worked in the past is why this concept of integrated risk management, bringing those data elements together with your risk registries and your control frameworks, is why everybody's trying to push to that direction. I just think we have a lot of hurdles technologically to make that happen, because no one's really built it trying to account for both of those well.
I would like to hope that when people look at IRM and people actually adopt IRM and it gives you improvements in your organization like that what's actually happening is you are not just looking at the compliance regs as checkboxes and saying, being compliance driven, saying, oh, we have to get this one thing patched because blah, 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 the guy at the end of the month. But I think when people actually take a step back and look a little more holistically and start thinking with different orgs and how things are affected, I think that brings a little more cognition into that process. At least that's what I've seen. So I think I hope that's a general trend. I hope that sort of gets people out of that sort of, cruise control of let's check the checkbox.
Let's hope so. That's what the new show is all about on Tuesdays, Security and Compliance Weekly, is we try to dig into those issues. But I brought this one in because of the nature of integrated risk management and the executive roles that need to participate in the process. I thought this article was a very good focus for this show. I could also cover this tomorrow if we wanted to on the other show. But to your point, we do want to get away from that aspect of the checkbox mentality. Regulations will require us to do certain things, but if we treat them as checkboxes and not as full-blown processes that have ties into a risk management framework, then we're going to miss the point, and hopefully we don't.
And I think the reason I called it out the way I did is for the leaders who are listening on here, when you actually pass that down to your team saying, hey, we need to be in compliance with these 3 things. By the way, the auditors are showing up in 2 weeks. Is to actually have them be cognizant, again, to use that word, that there's 2 ways their teams can deal with this, right? And to actually at least have that on their radar, that you don't want to, while you need to meet that, especially that first or second audit, take a step back and think about how is this actually being done, and how is this affecting your org, and is it being done in a comprehensive way?
Yes. Agreed. Gartner had a few interesting articles. The last 3 are all kind of around some Gartner stuff, and they had their symposium, I think, last week. So whenever Gartner does an event, you get some interesting news articles. The first one I wanted to cover is this concept of making IT strategic at the board level. And I think we've already seen trends of this already, where IT and technology is driving transformation in these organizations. And instead of it being looked at as just a cost center and a support center, it is starting to become more strategic. What Gartner's saying is, look, boards, you need to figure out how to embrace IT strategically to continue to move your businesses forward, which is great to hear. I think, like I said, I think it's happening, but I think maybe Gartner saying it a little more succinctly, it will also help, maybe the CIOs and the CISOs continue to help get their initiatives higher up at the board level, because that's where they need to be if we're going to do this right.
Yeah, I think there was some interesting points in this article. I think part of it they went sort of Gartnerish, sort of went out in the distance. I'm not too sure about what was it, hyper automation.
Yeah, the tech trends, yeah.
Yeah. But I think overall, I did like where they're going, and especially on the second article, which was the title of it, part 2, where they started talking more from
computing moves to the edge.
Yeah, exactly, and that's the point I was thinking of. As I start thinking about, what's on my mind right now, honestly, is it's, to me personally, I've been doing containers for 3, 4, 5 years. I sort of think I got the grasp on that, and I'm pondering what's next out there. Is serverless going to catch on? AI, as I said in the article, actually something different. Sorry, I'll shelf that. Someone else was talking this weekend about AI and CPU cycles, but yeah, I think that the second part where they talk strategically about it, going to the edge, I think is something that a lot of folks should be thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, the first article brings in some very good points, right? We were talking about automation and automating everything. We see the automation on the DevOps side. We're going to see the automation continue to advance on the security side, but hyper automation is automating everything. Okay, that's going to take some time, because to automate a process, you better have it well defined first. We've had to learn this ourselves over the past year or so, the Security Weekly. But yeah, there is this drive for automation, and that means DevOps and security and other components are going towards this automation piece. We're actually, the webcast we're doing on Thursday with ServiceNow actually talks about where people are in that automation cycle. It's actually interesting. We're not automated as much as people think we are. We have a long way to go, not to spoil it too much for the webcast, but we get into some of the details about where people are on that automation curve. We have a long way to go to get to this concept of hyper automation. Great point, but it's going to take some time to get there. But what I found really interesting, John, on the technology side of this is this concept of continuing to move to the edge. And you and I have a little bit of experience when we were doing aspects of this at Layered Insight, kind of seeing where the applications were moving, right? And the serverless technologies to enable industrial IoT and even IoT, and how these applications were going to interface with these billions of devices that we're going to bring online, right? That's a very interesting set of capabilities, but also creates some very interesting security challenges for organizations. So very interesting to watch. And then they talk about distributed cloud, which was a really interesting component, because we talk about cloud a lot, but this concept of distributed cloud and how the cloud providers will make it easier to manage infrastructure in various places around the world, I thought was a very interesting technological concept as well.
Yeah, it was one of Azure's announcements last week. Was they're now actually also going to be able to manage. So I think Amazon right now is the only one that can't manage the other guys, right? But no, you're spot on, and it's a lot of the stuff we've been thinking about for the last few years. I'll shut up in a second, Mike. But a lot of stuff we've been thinking about for the last few years has really been around, all these sort of separate pieces: the AppSec, the edge, the IoT, the AI. And we had, like I said before, some customers where your IoT devices on top of a windmill, and that gets sort of expensive to have network going off that on the byte level or kilobyte level. But now you're seeing all these things really start to come down and get boiled into a single concept that people are thinking about on the edge. And I think it really does take a lot of thought, like from a strategic point of view. Where do you want to go? How are you actually going to get there? Because there's a lot of pieces you got to sort of be able to kit together for that.
That's a really cool point, John, because that's one of the things I wanted to really dive into a little bit more, is that idea of that power to edge and distributed cloud, because I think it's going to be one of the things that's not clear yet are what are the good application patterns or good design patterns where edge is great and built for that, as well as what are the patterns that it's not so good for. And so one of the biggest or the immediate things that comes to my mind is handling secrets or encryption. So having sensors around the edge, put them close to clients, stick them on a windmill in the middle of a field. That makes a lot of sense because that's basically a relatively dumb sensor collecting some data, sending it back to probably a central spot for aggregation. But when you start to move data to the edge as well, in terms of having it for better privacy handling, for better whether it's just for better performance or something like that, you also have to start encrypting it and managing the keys around the edge as we continue to start to abstract a lot of these software components more and more into cloud service providers starts to, it doesn't mean that's necessarily going to be insecure. By no means am I going down that route. It just means we have to start rethinking which were our trust boundaries, where were our risk tolerances, and what are we going to do about here is where we think data is okay to move to. Here's where we want to encrypt. Here's where we want to where data can become unencrypted. And here is where our client ultimately can interact with it. And who knows what that client is. Well, that client could be human behind a web browser, could be an IoT device out in the middle of the ocean somewhere, or it could be, service to service. It could be, another business that's consuming this as an API. So all that's what I'm really interested to see is what those design patterns come out as we start talking about this edge.
Yeah, it's one thing. It can be difficult to correctly secure, say, a client to an API or something into the cloud, right? That you have to have your head on straight to get the crypto and stuff right in that. But what I've seen is once people start throwing that onto an IoT device, that's something now I can physically get my hands on. And you throw a JTAG debugger or a UART or something on there, and you suddenly have the ability to start pulling crypto keys out of it. So you really have to think a little bit more carefully about how do you do that key exchange and key management, and how many devices out there have been compromised, and countless, not to fear monger, but how much IP has been lost as once it gets onto an edge device and people go, oh, now that I've got a weekend, I can play with this and have some fun. So definitely requires a little more thought.
Yeah, the whole concept of data provenance ties in here really well to both the autonomous things, which was point number 3, and AI security. Because if we think about it, to your point, Mike, right, data becomes very important, and the provenance of that data becomes very important to make sure that what it's being used for to automatically drive things or to create AI models, if the data's tampered with, then how secure or how safe is an autonomous thing or your AI model that's trying to make decisions as a human, right? And so data becomes a very important part in here, not only for edge, but I also think this concept of autonomous things and AI models where tampered data could create havoc.
Yeah, I think we'll see a lot of interesting things. So for as much as we're also talking about the cloud right now, it was just, I think it was last week, maybe the week before, Google announced a open source effort around chip design. And things like secure enclaves, trusted enclaves. There's also RISC-V, or is it RISC-V? I always forget which is the correct pronunciation. But that's another open source approach to this type of model, much like the closed approach of the Apple iOS and hardware ecosystem. And so these ways you can also now start to at least have some hardware to back a little bit more trusted boot, or trusted computing environment that can at least build some more confidence. So data collection, just as you're describing, Matt, you can at least detect tampering ideally, or prevent too much of the bad data coming in to poison the AI model and start attacking it from those more data-focused types of security problems.
Yeah. Data's still a big key here, which kind of got sprinkled in the article, but I don't think it highlighted as much as we just did it here for them. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today while Paul and Jason are out. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next week on Business Security Weekly.